Welcome back to Hot Air, where the chaos, the sass, the facts, and the outrage are all the things that you signed up for. I am your host, Josh, and today we're going to get into a topic that is equal parts enraging and heartbreaking. We're talking the ways religion, doctrine, and so called morality have been used to control, shame, and manipulate LGBTQ plus people. We're talking history, personal stories I'm going to pull in, global perspectives, because we're not just focusing here on North America, literature, and a whole lot of reflection. And again, as I said in the previous episode, before I get into this and get any feathers ruffled, this episode is not about attacking faith itself. I am all for religious freedom. Believing what you want and practicing your spirituality on your own terms, I'm here for it. But facts are facts, and knowing the history, understanding the structures, and seeing how doctrine has been twisted, it matters. It shapes how people are treated, how identities are policed, and yes, sometimes how harm is justified. And before we get into that, make sure you're following me on Instagram at _hotairpod. It's the same on TikTok at _hotairpod. Visit my website to shop my fun merch for the holiday season. Also, you can submit your listener stories there and topic suggestions, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com. And I also want to say that December, all of these episodes are almost a series. Every one is leading into the next. And today's episode is kind of a bridge between last week's episode or last Tuesday's episode, which was about Bible mistranslations, and it's going to lead us into next Tuesday's episode. So I feel like all of these bleed together, they line up, they all kind of play into each other, and that's how it's going to be also in January and in February. I kind of like the idea of these series that have themes, and so we are sticking with it. And I do have positive stories to share as well. So not all of this is going to be hammering down on religion and accusing Bible thumpers of mistranslating. I do have some more uplifting episodes that are revolving around religion. So don't worry, we'll get to some happy stuff in December since it is the season of giving. So over the next 5 segments in this episode, we're going to start with history, how faith and moral policing intersect, and how doctrine has been wielded as a tool for control. Then we're going to move into personal testimonies from survivors who've lived through coercion, shame, and manipulation, followed by a look at the international context, which I find very interesting because this is not just a North American problem. After that, we'll dive into memoirs and long-form accounts that chronicle the lived experiences and the systemic patterns of harm. And finally, we're going to reflect, analyze, and consider the broader damage that this has caused to mental health, families, communities, and society at large. And my goal in doing all of this is maybe someone's going to listen that has experienced some of this stuff or is in the depths, in the middle of it. And this might open up a pathway for them to heal or leave a situation that is not going to change their sexual preference, regardless of their family's beliefs or their religious beliefs. So you cannot pray the gay away. So I'm hoping that this will open the eyes of some listeners or inspire some of you to inspire others. It's going to be a fun ride. Some things that are going to piss you off, empathy, truth, and of course, all the hot air you can ask for. So why don't we get this going? Let's hit it. Part 1. When faith becomes control. Let's peel back the curtain of one of the oldest internet in real life scams, using religion like holy books, sermons, church authority as a weapon to control people. Not salvation, not comfort, but control. Real control. And I'm going to walk you through how that happened, how it still happens, and why it matters. And don't worry, I brought the receipts. So, religion, in my opinion, at its best, can offer community, meaning, identity, ritual. For a lot of folks, it's what keeps them grounded. But when institutions grab hold of that power, when church leaders, traditions, doctrine become the tool instead of the guide, what you get isn't faith, it's more of a cage. And that cage comes with rules about who you should be, not who you actually are. Take the history of moral policing. Throughout time, religious authorities have claimed the right to define what is natural and what is a sin, what is acceptable, and then punish deviation from what is acceptable. Whether it was medieval courts crushing heresy, inquisitions deciding who's quote unquote pure, or entire societies enforcing laws about morality, religion handed down the rulebook, and the rest of us had to follow or suffer. That history matters because the line from moral policing to identity policing to outright suppression is thinner than people would like to admit. And fast forward to modern days. In the last century, as sexual orientation and gender identity began to emerge more publicly, let's be clear, it's always been there, but more publicly, these religious institutions faced a problem. People whose hearts, bodies, or souls didn't match the monopoly on morality that the church claimed. Rather than welcome that difference, which would have been much easier, many churches doubled down on control. They framed natural attraction or difference not as identity or diversity, but as a disorder, something to be fixed, something to be healed. Programs appeared that promised salvation, purity, redemption, but often delivered more shame, more repression, and more guilt. And for decades, this was the help that was offered to queer people by religious communities. One of the biggest shifts in recent years, or at least what looks like a shift, came in 2013. The newly elected Pope Francis, fresh off the plane, returning from World Youth Day, he was asked a question about gay priests. Instead of a typical condemnation, he said, if someone is gay and searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? Those 5 words. Who am I to judge? Cracked something open. For many LGBTQ Catholics, closeted believers, people who had been living in fear for decades, it felt like the first soft knock on the door of a prison that they didn't even know that they were in. And suddenly, a powerful religious figure was saying maybe faith doesn't have to be a straitjacket. Maybe identity doesn't have to be a problem. And maybe people are just allowed to exist whoever they might be. But as always, there's a twist, so here's where the plot twist comes. It looks like change, but under the hood, doctrine did not budge. The church hasn't officially undeclared its stance that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. What changed, superficially, was tone. It was the language, the kind of vibe, the overall vibe, and that's insidious because tone can often soothe guilt. It lowers guardrails. It makes you feel like maybe it's not so bad, but if the foundation stays the same, which it did, the rules stay the same. I believe the new priest recently even said that marriage is between a man and a woman, but he also says some things that are a bit more progressive, so I'm not sure. Now, what this all does is breed confusion, and it breeds hope and pain. Also, often all of it happening at one time. For someone who grew up pulsing with faith, being told you're welcome while still being told your love is wrong, I imagine feels like standing on cracked glass. Hope bleeding into shame. It's a forced double life. Your truth backstage, guilt, and fear on stage. And this manipulation isn't just limited to doctrine or pulpit talk. It seeps into community pressure, family expectations, social norms. Religion becomes a policing force, not just spiritually, but socially. People start internalizing that difference equals danger and sin and shame. They police their own minds, bodies, who they love, which, by the way, is exactly how some of the worst harms like shame, self-hate, secret living, even forced conversion therapy gain traction. Because once difference is framed as disorder, someone somewhere will offer a fix. And that might be a little hint at next week's episode, but continuing on. This is all the danger. It's not sermon, not the scripture, the mindset that says identity equals problem, the idea that truth has to fit into a grid, the belief that love needs some sort of boundaries, and it's always defined by someone else. But let me be real with you. There are cracks, very real ones, because language and tone, those might seem small compared to doctrine, but they do matter. They shift how people feel. They open tiny windows where before there were iron bars. And for some people, for some believers, that crack is enough to push open the door. It's enough to question. It's enough to rebel a little bit. It's enough to hold on to their truth while clinging to their faith. That tension, faith versus control, identity versus doctrine, is where a lot of pain has lived. But it's also where resistance can grow, where truth can slip through, where identity can survive. And that, my dear listeners, is why this conversation is important and why it matters, not just for queer folks, not just for people from the LGBTQ plus community, not just for religious folks either, for anyone who's ever been told that being themselves is a problem that is always put on you by somebody else. Because the moment religion becomes about policing souls instead of nurturing them, then we really all lose. And next up, we're going to get a little bit more personal. We're going to hear real stories from people who lived through religious control and tried to escape it. I found all of these during my research process, so they are legitimate as far as I can tell. Very reputable news sources have shared these. We're going to look globally. We'll tear open history. We're going to dig into the institutions, and we'll ask the hardest question: can faith ever be used without breaking people? Because it always seems like someone is breaking. So if you did put your seatbelt on, like I told you to, then you're great. If you haven't, buckle it up. We're still riding, and it's going to be worth it. So moving on, part 2, first-person accounts and survivor testimonies. This is probably the part of the episode that hits the hardest. This is real people's lives. These are the ones who survived religious manipulation and, in some cases, outright abuse. And I'm not talking statistics. I'm talking stories you can feel in your bones. Stories that made headlines. Stories that survivors shared online, in forums, on the news, where people finally got to unburden themselves. And this is the part where theory meets lived experience, because I've done a lot of talking. But here is the cold hard truth. Let's start with someone that I came across while digging through a survivor advocacy forum. This person was 17, deeply religious, and had the audacity to develop a same-sex crush. Yes, a crushingly normal human experience. Their parents, who were conservative Christians, found out, and the message was very clear to them. The message was, we love you, but you are sinful, and you need to be fixed. I can't imagine being told that. That fix wasn't therapy in any modern or safe sense. This was a religious conversion program, a camp run by a conservative church group that promised redemption but delivered isolation, shame, and constant surveillance. Every night, they were forced to confess their tempting thoughts, write essays about sin, and pray for forgiveness for desires that weren't technically wrong. I mean, in my opinion. They told the forum, they also said, and I quote, I lied awake crying because I felt like my real self was unacceptable. I was anesthetized into shame. I couldn't see how to escape me, end quote. And the kicker? When they left, depression followed. I mean, I'm not sure if kicker is the right word, but they isolated themselves. There was self-loathing, but years later, therapy, friends, and finally embracing their queer identity gave them back their life. And today they posted as an update that they are queer, they are loved, they refuse to let that program define them, which is very powerful. It's very raw, unflinching, and yet this isn't a singular story. There are hundreds, thousands, maybe millions just like it. Then there's a different kind of story. Someone who stayed in the church, but to challenge it from within, which I think is also badass, but very interesting. A progressive priest from from an affirming LGBTQ plus church who grew up watching friends get shamed for desires, whispered about in sermons, sidelined, or pushed into silence. When they themselves came out as queer, they initially faced rejection and fear. But then they found a way to channel it into something radical, which was inclusion. They told an interviewer, and I quote, "I've seen people heal from the same religious trauma that once tried to crush them," end quote. And now in their congregation, LGBTQ plus folks aren't just tolerated, they are celebrated. The story is so important because it shows that the harm isn't inherent in faith. It's the manipulation, the fear, the control. Faith can be a sanctuary, not a prison, when it's wielded with intention rather than dominance. But let's layer another voice on top of that, because we're not just in the US here. Like I said, we're going global. I found a testimony published in New Zealand News about a man who was sent to a Christian quote unquote healing camp in his teens. His experience included extreme isolation, daily Bible study with passages explicitly condemning homosexuality, which there are very few of them, and group interventions where participants were shamed for any hint of attraction to the same sex. He described it as psychological torture, saying, I quote, "They didn't even try to hide the fact that they were breaking us to rebuild us. I spent months trying to be someone that I wasn't," end quote. Today, he's an activist, working to ban conversion therapy in his country. We also have voices from the UK. A survivor blog that I found shared the story of a young woman pressured by her parents, who were Pentecostal, to enter a faith-based corrective retreat. That's such a fancy way of putting it, because she was gender nonconforming. There, she faced 8-hour sessions of confessions, strict curfews, and constant monitoring. She wrote online, I quote, "It felt like they were trying to erase me, but all they did was make me stronger in my own truth. I left knowing who I really was, but I lost years of my life to fear," end quote. And then, for contrast, the story of someone who found solace in queer affirming faith communities online, because I don't want to just talk about these scary negative things. I found their long form reflection in an online queer spiritual forum. They said, and I quote, I don't know if I need to say and I quote, but I feel like I need to, right? I quote, so you know when I'm starting what they're saying. So, and I quote, "I grew up hearing that being gay was evil, that God hated me, that I was broken. I spent years in churches that told me I had to pray it away. And then, in an online community of affirming Christians, I realized that God did not need me to erase myself. I could exist fully, faith and identity coexisting. That changed my life," end quote. The point here is critical. Trauma isn't universal, but the damage inflicted by religion's misuse certainly is. And healing doesn't always mean leaving faith behind. It can mean reclaiming it on your own terms. Just like how we all kind of like build our life as we grow up, we change our perspective on almost everything. We're building a new perspective and a new life. We can do that with religion as well. Now, the reoccurring theme across all of these stories is pretty simple. It's fear, shame, guilt, and isolation. They are not byproducts. They're often the whole entire point. Institutions have historically weaponized morality to control behavior, monitor identity, and maintain power. These personal testimonies put faces, emotions, voices, and humanity on what could otherwise feel very abstract. We see despair, confusion, resilience, and eventual reclamation. Let's also not forget the internet itself as a resource for these stories. Survivor forums, news articles, blogs, advocacy groups, all of them allow voices to rise that might otherwise remain silenced. Some survivors post anonymously, some under their real names, but each one provides a roadmap for understanding the psychological cost of manipulation, the systemic nature of the harm, and the ways people fight back. And yes, sometimes their fight back looks like litigation, sometimes it's activism, sometimes just telling their story so someone else can recognize that they are not alone. And that is truly the whole entire point of this series. And if we step back for a hot second and look at the emotional through line, These accounts are gut-wrenching, sure. They're enraging. They're also incredibly instructive. They teach us about the mechanisms of power, the strategies of fear, the ways that love and identity can be systematically suppressed. And they remind us that despite decades, centuries even, of institutional pressure, human resilience is staggering. People reclaim their identities, people reclaim their spiritual paths, people speak, write, and organize. And those voices, survivors and allies alike, are reshaping the conversation around faith and identity, and slowly, brick by brick, building anew. So that is the landscape we're operating in. Faces, voices, raw lived experience, interwoven with commentary and context. It's harrowing, it's inspiring, and it sets the stage for where we are going to go next. Because we went a little bit global, but we're going to go like global, where the stories are not just American or British or Kiwi. They're even more international, from places where religious coercion looks very different, but the consequences are similar, if not the same. We're going to see how faith is wielded as control across the globe and how those in LGBTQ plus communities survive, resist, and demand recognition. Part 3, International and Global Contexts. Very simple title, very easy way to put it. My favorite quote, let's zoom out, because the way religion, scripture, and doctrine get weaponized against LGBTQ plus people is not just a Western problem. It is a worldwide phenomenon, and the patterns, while culturally specific, are very familiar no matter where you look. Take Uganda, for example. In 2014, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, often dubbed the Kill the Gays Bill in international headlines, passed. Not exactly a subtle move, I would say, and religious institutions played a major role in advocating for it. Evangelical leaders, some from the U.S. missionary organizations, traveled to Uganda preaching that homosexuality was an abomination. Churches openly lobbied for the law. LGBTQ plus Ugandans found themselves targeted not just socially, but legally. And as reported by the BBC, many were subjected to conversion programs that included forced prayers, counseling sessions, and extreme shaming rituals, all justified with scripture. One Ugandan survivor shared with Human Rights Watch that they told him that he was broken and he had to pray the gay out of himself. And he cried every night and thought that God hated him. Over in Russia, the situation takes a different form. There's no official conversion camps in the same style as in the US or Uganda. I mean, at least that we're aware of. But state-backed religious rhetoric combined with laws banning the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations creates a social climate where LGBTQ plus identity must be hidden. As The Guardian reported, some conservative Orthodox communities offer church-run counseling to correct same-sex attraction. While not as organized as a camp, the psychological pressure is the same: shame, fear, secrecy, and the threat of social exile. One Russian activist said, "They may not put you in a room for weeks, but every sermon, every community message, every law is a conversion attempt in itself. It's insidious." End quote. And then you go to Brazil. Brazil's majority Catholic population might seem progressive in some urban centers, but evangelical megachurches are rapidly growing. In these spaces, LGBTQ plus youth have reported being sent to intense counseling sessions framed as spiritual healing. The Brazilian news site G1 Globo covered a teenager who was placed in a church-run program where he was required to read Bible passages that apparently condemn same-sex love and perform penance exercises daily. He said, "They made me believe my feelings were a sickness. They told me I could be healed if I stopped loving who I loved, and I believed it, and it broke me for years." End quote. And it's not just these big countries. Of course, we hear about them because they are larger and it's more publicized, but even smaller, less globally prominent nations see the same patterns. In Malaysia, conservative religious authorities promote so-called rehabilitation programs for LGBTQ plus Muslims. According to a news source there, these include compulsory counseling sessions, Quaran's study emphasizing moral conformity and pressure to enter heterosexual marriage. That sounds like hell. Survivors have reported forced medication, sleep deprivation, and public shaming. One young man wrote anonymously online, "It felt like God had turned against me because of who I was. I feared speaking to anyone. I feared praying. I felt trapped in my own faith." And here is the thread connecting all of these stories. Whether in Africa, Europe, Latin America, or Southeast Asia, religious institutions and conservative communities often define morality in ways that directly conflict with LGBTQ plus identity. And once that moral framework is internalized, individuals experience coercion, shame, and extreme cases, a hell of a lot of trauma. The forms vary from formal camps to counseling sessions to legal threats to social pressure, but the mechanism is exactly the same: control through spiritual authority. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Josh, that's all depressing as hell. And how did these people survive? Because same, really. That's the other side of the coin, and it's just as global. In Uganda, activists who escaped religious conversion programs now run shelters and online communities, sharing resources for youth to find safety and affirmation. In Russia, underground LGBTQ plus networks provide spiritual support, affirming that faith and queerness can coexist. In Brazil and Malaysia, individuals form online spaces, often anonymous, to validate one another's experiences, swap coping strategies, and celebrate their identities outside the reach of coercive doctrine. The common factor is human resilience. Even in countries where laws, families, and churches are actively hostile, queer people find ways to survive and resist and thrive. And it's really quite terrifying to think that this all has to be underground in 2025. And it's important to note that international media coverage has been pretty crucial. Platforms like Human Rights Watch, BBC, The Guardian, and others give voice to survivors who might otherwise remain invisible. Their reporting, combined with social media and online forums and podcasts like this, creates an international network of witnesses and accountability. For instance, survivor testimonies posted on Reddit, Tumblr, and other forums have allowed people in isolated areas to see that they are not alone. One anonymous contributor on a forum shared, "Reading about someone in another country going through the same thing made me feel seen, and it made me realize I was not broken, that I was human." End quote. As I said, this really just shows that religious manipulation is a global problem, but the resistance is global too, and if not stronger. Faith can be wielded to harm, and it can be reclaimed to heal. Each story that we highlighted, each survivor voice, each activist, each supportive community adds layers to understanding how power and morality intersect with identity around the world. And as we move into our next little bit, we're going to explore memoirs, literature, and long-form accounts of forced conversion therapy. We're going to see these global patterns reflected in personal narratives that make abstract policies and doctrine tangible, intimate, and painfully real. So again, check your seatbelts, bitches. I haven't really sworn this episode. I need to curse a little bit more. Bitches, buckle up. We're going to go even deeper. We're turning the lens inward to lived, chronicled experiences, more of them, and more people that came forth to tell their stories, expose the machinery of religious control, and in some cases, reclaim their faith entirely on their own terms. Part 4, Memoirs and Forced Conversion Therapy. It's time to dig into how these experiences have been recorded, analyzed, and reflected on in memoirs and long-form literature. This is where the personal meets the literary. The raw lived experiences meets documentation that exposes patterns, shame, way more trauma, and way more resilience. These aren't just stories, they're the evidence that we need. It's the history, it's the roadmap for understanding how religious coercion works, and often under the guise of help or spiritual guidance. Let's start with Boy Erased by Gerard Conley, one of the most widely read memoirs about forced conversion therapy. Conley recounts growing up in a conservative Southern Baptist household in Arkansas. discovering his queer identity and being coerced into attending a church based program designed to cure him of homosexuality. He describes brutal practices, long hours of counseling sessions where he was forced to confess sexual thoughts, shame inducing exercises, lectures that equated desire with sin, and even physical isolation. Conley writes, "They didn't just want to change my behavior, they wanted to erase my mind, my identity, the parts of me that made me human." Reading it, you realize the trauma wasn't just spiritual, it was psychological, it was emotional, it was physical. Conley's story isn't unique, it mirrors countless experiences across the US and globally. So if you have not, you should read it. Then there's This Is How It Always Is by Lori Frankel, which, while fictional, draws heavily from interviews and documented accounts of LGBTQ plus youth navigating conservative and often religious households. Through her characters, Frankel illustrates the tension between familial love, faith, and societal expectations. The family struggle is palpable. They love their children, yet they're influenced by doctrine that pathologize difference. Books like this aren't just entertainment, they're mirrors reflecting the invisible battles of countless queer kids raised under religious authority. And again, if you haven't, you should read it. Moving internationally, we can't ignore literature coming from survivors outside of the US. In the UK, memoirs such as Boy Interrupted and blogs chronicling church run reparative programs provide firsthand testimony. One survivor recounts being sent to a Pentecostal retreat for 3 months, subjected to prayer, forced self reflection, and public confession rituals. They later wrote online, "I felt like every part of me was being interrogated, judged, and found guilty before God and man. I learned that faith could be twisted into a weapon." These accounts are published on survivor advocacy platforms like Beyond Conversion Therapy UK, ensuring these stories are preserved and visible. Even academic studies often draw from personal narratives to underline the psychological and emotional impact. The Journal of LGBTQ plus Youth published a study where 70 participants recounted experiences in religiously motivated conversion programs. Participants described their shame, their anxiety, their depression, self-harm, and PTSD. One participant quoted in the study said, "I was told my very existence was sinful. I prayed constantly to change, and when I couldn't, I blamed myself. The church didn't just fail me, it actively harmed me." These memoirs, blogs, and studies converge to form a chorus of lived truth. The harm was systemic, deliberate, let's be clear, deliberate, and deeply personal. And then there's the collection called Surviving Conversion Therapy: Stories from the Front Lines, which gathers multiple accounts from survivors across the entire globe. These anthologies are vital because they highlight both diversity and commonality. Teenagers coerced in Texas, young adults in Canada, even minors in small towns in Australia. What connects them all? The feeling of being made to believe their innate identity was immoral, or unacceptable, or broken. One contributor, reflecting on their experience in a religious program in Ontario, Canada, wrote, "I left feeling empty, scared, and convinced I was unlovable. It wasn't God I lost faith in, it was myself." Which is powerful and brutal and almost makes me want to cry, but it's also very illuminating. It's like, you want God, you say God is loving, but these people are being forced to hate themselves and they lose faith in the whole being that you want them to have faith in. Doesn't make sense, doesn't track. There's also memoirs that reveal coping strategies and paths to healing. Many survivors describe reclaiming their faith on their own terms. They write about embracing spirituality in ways that affirm identity rather than punish it. One survivor from a California-based LGBTQ plus affirming church said online, "I realized God never hated me. My church did. My parents did. But God was fine with me being queer, and that saved me." Literature, memoirs, and essays don't just catalog abuse, they provide a roadmap for understanding recovery, community, and self acceptance. and possibly a path for somebody else to follow towards healing. And let's not forget how media adaptations amplify these stories. Boy Erased was made into a film starring Lucas Hedges and Nicole Kidman, which helped bring conversion therapy into mainstream disclosure. Suddenly, people who never read the memoir were confronted with the same story, the same shame, the same coercion, and maybe realizing that it isn't just an American problem. It's a religious power dynamic issue that spans culture, geography, and denomination. These accounts also have a cumulative effect. While a single survivor story is extremely powerful, a memoir, an anthology, a study, and a fictionalized novel together illustrate the pattern that religion can be weaponized, that doctrine can be twisted, that families, institutions, and communities can convince people their very being is unacceptable. And the consequences are depression, are trauma, identity suppression, isolation. That is all lifelong. But as we've seen in the global context, survivors are resilient. And memoirs often end with a reclamation of self, of faith, or both. They shine light on the trauma and they illuminate the path forward. And as I said, and perhaps it's illuminating that path for somebody else as well. And by the end of, reading those books and viewing those films, we understand that the issue is simply systemic. It's not accidental. It's not that a few bad actors made mistakes. It's that systems and doctrines and power structures have been designed to enforce conformity. And the personal stories, the memoirs, the essays, and the research give life to abstract policy, abstract theology, and ideology. They make the invisible visible. They make the pain understandable, and ultimately, they make the case for change impossible to ignore. So let's just remember, these stories are not just historical curiosities or media fodder. They are the living evidence, the testimony to the human cost of religious coercion, and a reminder of how crucial it is to listen, to validate, and to support survivors. Now, in our final little bit of this episode, we're going to step back even further. Commentary, reflection, a little bit of analysis, and explore the broader societal, psychological, and cultural damages that these practices have caused and why the lessons matter beyond just these individual stories. So, part 5, commentary, analysis, and reflection. Now, if you look at the stories one by one, it's heart-wrenching, sure, but the patterns might not hit you. Once you look at the cumulative impact, you start to see a system of harm that reaches far beyond the individual. Let's start with mental health, because you can't separate trauma from its consequences. Studies and survivor accounts consistently show elevated rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and even suicide among people subjected to conversion therapy. According to a 2018 study published in the American Journal of Public Health, LGBTQ+ adults who underwent conversion therapy were nearly twice as likely to report suicide attempts compared to those who didn't. Survivors often describe years, even decades, of living with internalized shame, guilt, and fear. One survivor quoted in a Human Rights Watch report said, "I spent years thinking God hated me, that my love was wrong. I hated myself for being me. That's not just a personal problem, that's a societal failure." And it's not just psychology. It's a public health issue because when entire communities are subjected to systemic shame, the ripple effects touch everyone around them. Now, let's talk families. Many survivors describe the devastation of parental and familial complicity. When religious authority dictates morality, families become enforcers of harm, even unintentionally. Some people think they're doing what's right. A young man in a Canadian memoir wrote, "My parents thought they were saving me, but they broke my trust, my sense of safety, and the belief that love could be unconditional." That's a multi-generational trauma right there. Families fractured, relationships strained, trust undermined. Communities are affected too because fear of social shaming keeps people silent. And silence, my friends, is exactly what allows these practices to continue. Now, on a societal level, religiously backed conversion programs and moral policing reinforce discrimination and prejudice. They validate systemic homophobia and transphobia. They influence legislation, social attitudes, and even mental health care policy. In countries like Uganda, Russia, and Malaysia, laws targeting LGBTQ plus people are reinforced by religious rhetoric. So, no separation with church and state. Even in countries where the law does not condone it, cultural and religious pressure shapes schools, workplaces, and local communities. One activist quoted by BBC News said, "Conversion therapy isn't just a private ordeal. It teaches everyone around you that you're broken. It normalizes hate." And that normalization seeps into every facet of life: education, employment, healthcare, and social spaces. Then there's the intergenerational cultural effect. Survivors often carry the weight of that stigma into their own families, into their relationships and parenting, should they have children. Even decades later, many report lingering self doubt, hypervigilance about morality, and fear of rejection. And those who are parents themselves sometimes struggle with how to raise children in faith traditions without repeating that harm. And this isn't just theory, it's real, lived consequence. And as I like to say again, here's the kicker, but not really a kicker: damage is not only measured in trauma, it's also measured in lost potential. In memoirs, blogs, and survivor accounts, people talk about dreams that were deferred, opportunities that were missed, talents they completely suppressed, and creativity stifled, all because energy and time were spent trying to be someone that they were not, instead of just being themselves. Conversion therapy and coercive religious programming don't just hurt identity, they steal years, aspirations, confidence, and frequently life. Now let's balance that with resilience, because we've seen it in every segment here. Survivors aren't just victims, they're fighters. They're actually not victims, they are survivors. They're survivors, they're fighters, organizers, authors, educators, activists. Many go on to write these amazing memoirs. They start nonprofits, they testify in legal cases, or create online communities. In Australia, activists who escaped religious conversion programs successfully lobbied for legislation banning the practice. And in the US, organizations like the Trevor Project, they provide support, counseling, and advocacy. Globally, survivor networks allow people to reclaim their faith, identity, and community, proving that even under immense pressure, resistance always thrives. And finally, let's talk about what this means for all of us listening, and I guess also for me speaking. Reflection is not just empathy, it's education, it's action. Recognizing patterns of coercion, understanding the psychological, social, and legal impact, and amplifying survivor voices is how we stop harm from continuing. It's why memoirs matter. It's why investigative journalism matters, and why speaking truth, even if it's sarcastically and with some swear words like I do here, it's why it matters. Because if we ignore the systemic damage, if we shrug and say, well, that's just religion, we let institutions off the hook. We let manipulation continue unchecked. And just think about how many people out there are undergoing this conversion therapy, not just here in the United States, but around the world, while we're sitting here listening to this episode. We can use our voices. We can spread this. We can spread the word. It's kind of like I'm preaching now. You can spread the word of hot air like they spread the word of Jesus, and you can reach someone. You might just be that final little voice that they need to reclaim their life and maybe reclaim their religion and be who they are authentically. So, there you have it. History, personal testimony, global perspectives, literature, and some cute reflection. What do we walk away with? We walk away with a little bit of clarity on religion, faith, and doctrine. They're not inherently harmful, as I've said, but when they're wielded as a weapon to control identity and enforce morality that is made up by somebody and suppress who you actually are, that damage is deep, okay? It's measurable. We can measure that damage, and it is long lasting. We walk away knowing survivors are brave, communities are resilient, and change is possible, but it requires vigilance, awareness, and speaking out. And if you listen this far, you're part of that awareness. So, all right, Hot Air fam, that is a wrap on this dive into all of this very heavy, deep business. If this episode left you feeling a little bit sad and enraged, maybe a little inspired to rise up and speak out, that's exactly the point. I literally feel like after just recording this, I'm like, I need to go save someone's life. I need to go do something about this. I need to speak to somebody who has done conversion therapy and like take that voice to the masses, people. And as always, if you want to keep the conversation going, you can follow me on Instagram at _hotairpod. Submit your listener stories or topic suggestions, or shop my merch on my website, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com. Because every little message, every merch purchase helps support Hot Air. It helps to keep me loud and proud and unfiltered, okay? And of course, don't forget to subscribe, like, and rate and share wherever you are listening. Above all, that matters more than anything. If you aren't going to follow me, if you aren't going to write in, like the episode, rate the podcast, whatever platform you're in, that is how we uplift these voices. Okay, and actually, lastly, for those of you who thought that today was intense, as I said, these episodes bridge and morph into each other. So next episode is going to be my deepest dive yet, all about conversion therapy. I've talked about it before, but this one gets real deep into it. We're talking the full story, the real horror, and the voices that will haunt you long after the episode ends. Not to make you like scared and not want to listen. This is important. It's going to be pretty raw, and you're definitely not going to want to miss it. This episode has been heavy, but necessary, and it's only through telling, hearing, and reflecting on these stories that we can ensure the next generation is not subjected to the same manipulation and harm. If somebody in 10 years finds this episode and they decide to live their most authentic life and reclaim their religion and do what's best for them and escape conversion therapy or whatever toxic situation they're in, I'm happy. I'm good. So until then, stay bold, stay loud, stay proud, stay out of conversion therapy if you can. And I will see you next Tuesday.